I hope you will come back and tell us more stories in the future. Okay, a change of mood now with a much darker story. Would you please welcome my co-host, Michael McRay.
Disclaimer for this, this story contains somewhat graphic descriptions of blood and violence, so if you have a queasy stomach, prepare. It's not that terrible, but just be wary. That particular Friday in December began as my Fridays usually did. Quiet morning of conversation with my grandmother, silent meditation, and a 30-minute drive to the prison where I volunteered as a chaplain. The first couple of hours inside the compound were filled with laughter as the chaplain's department hosted a pizza party celebrating the completion of a Christmas package distribution. I personally made quick work of 4 pieces, and then grabbing a handheld radio, I headed to Unit 4, where I would not be making quick work. This was my 3rd visit to Unit 4, a maximum security unit, where 2 of the 4 pods, the ones to which I was assigned, contained 24 cells that hold both young and old men designated as mental health inmates. This unit is certainly the most violent in the prison, as stress levels stay dangerously high. I breathed in deeply and walked through the razor wire gate and into the concrete building. The smell hit me first, as it always did. With so much blood and human waste regularly decorating the walls, a vulgar stench remains no matter how much scrubbing occurs. Because of incidents that day, the officer in charge would not permit any inmate to be brought out for conversation. I would have to go cell side. Before entering, an officer warned me that the pod had been crazy all day. Acknowledging his caution, I called into the radio unit, Charlie Main, Charlie Gate, and within seconds, the thick steel door and iron gate opened, granting me access to the pod. As soon as the gate closed behind me, a cacophony of "Chaplain, Chaplain!" sounded from all corners of the pod. I shouted from the entrance that I would be around to see each man. I started with Mr. Freeman, a man I had met just a few weeks earlier in the infirmary after he had set fire to the shirt on his back to get attention. We seemed to have connected surprisingly well that day, so I wanted to pay him another visit. As I moved through the pod, I began to notice escalating noise coming from a cell in the center of the far wall. I skipped ahead to that cell, one that belonged to Mr. Saylor, who within 2 hours would be rushed to the hospital close to death. I greeted him cordially, having never met him before I introduced myself. "I'm Chaplain McRay." "Okay," he shrugged, smirking at me. His clean face looked young, and I guessed we must be very close in age. As I do with each man, I made sure to look him in the eyes while we talked. "You doing okay?" I asked him, smiling, trying to keep a positive demeanor so as not to provoke any aggression. He tilted his head as he looked at me through the glass. He was bouncing slightly, almost as if he was excited about something. Then his right hand took a small razor and quickly cut his left forearm. Raking his hand through the blood, he then smeared it down his face, over his nose, mouth, and chin. One glob rested above his eye. "Do I look okay?" he challenged. His whole demeanor suggested he wanted me to be intimidated, impressed, perhaps even to quiver in awe. I laughed instead, hoping this unexpected reaction would have a de-escalating effect. I asked if there was anything I could do for him. "Just give me a straight ticket on the road to hell." He swayed back and forth as he spoke. I asked him why he wanted to go to hell. "Everybody wants to go to hell." There was an unsettling confidence in his laugh. Calmly, I asked him why he wanted to go to hell. "Oh, it'll be fun," he told me. "All that burning." And then he lifted his left arm. It was spotted with burn marks and blood from various razor cuts that day. Scars ran in between, telling me this was not the first day he had drawn blood from that limb. I asked him what was wrong. He shouted at me, "Man, I'm just fucking tired of it. Nobody here fucking cares about me." I looked him straight in the eyes and said as genuinely as I could, "I'm trying to care, Mr. Saylor. That's why I'm standing here talking to you." "You don't give a shit about me," he hollered, turning around laughing. He walked back toward his bed, and I knew he had no reason to believe I cared about him. When he returned to the narrow window, I told him I needed to call medical since he was bleeding. When I asked an officer to make the call, he informed me that I had to leave the pod. I protested, but in vain. I apologized to Mr. Saylor and turned to walk down the stairs, passing 3 officers on their way up to his cell. Before I reached the floor, I heard one of the officers shout, "He's squirting! He got an artery!" The corporal shouted through the radio unit for immediate medical help. Then he yelled to me to run find latex gloves in the central staff pod. Searching frantically, I located 2 pairs and rushed back into the pod and up the stairs. The corporal instructed me to wait on the lower level. 4 officers gathered at his open door, and from where I stood below, I could see it all. Just as I had walked away from Mr. Saylor's door, he had sliced clean through an artery in the bend of his left arm. Streaks of blood now covered his whitewashed walls as if someone had taken a squirt bottle and turned circles in the room, squirting constantly. I saw him sitting calmly on his bed at the back of the cell, a laser quivering on his chest from the taser directed at him. A large gash stretched across his arm, blood streaming down his forearm onto his pants. The officers handcuffed him so he could not cut anymore, and the medical team wrapped a bandage around the severed artery. But by that time, he had already lost so much blood that he soon collapsed, unconscious. 4 officers carried him down the stairs, out of the pod, and toward the infirmary. I stood there, perhaps in shock, as if I was in a stupor. Suddenly, I regained a sense of awareness as I heard another man calling for me. Hustling up the stairs, I moved toward his cell and peered into the window. I saw Mr. Jackson there, tattoos covering his face, anger in his eyes, and nothing in his cell. In cries of anguish, he told me what had happened. How in an act of retaliation toward another inmate the day before, he had thrown feces out of his pie flap. But these feces hit an officer instead. Mr. Jackson cried out to me, "I didn't mean to hit the officer. I told him over and over, I'm sorry, but they won't listen to me. I can't take it anymore." He dropped to his bed, head in his hands, body shaking in anger. My eyes scanned his cell. All his possessions had been taken in punishment. Nothing remained but a coarse blanket. Mr. Jackson's desperation almost broke me on the spot, and it took all I had to keep it together. Numerous times while listening to him, I had to ask him to pause because I could not hear him. The pod had descended into chaos after Mr. Saylor was removed. Men were horse-kicking their doors, shouting and throwing things in fits of rage. Even with my ear pressed to the door and Mr. Jackson shouting on the other side, I could barely hear him. Promising Mr. Jackson I would bring him a book to read to keep his mind occupied until he received his property, I moved swiftly around the pod trying to de-escalate. I felt I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I was just making it up as I went. But one by one, the men grew quieter and their razors disappeared. I headed out of Unit 4 and walked back to the chaplain's office to get books for Mr. Jackson. As I walked into the crisp, cold air, the only words I could muster were those that had begun monastic prayers for centuries. "O God, come to our assistance. O Lord, make haste to help us." Back at the chaplain's office, the head chaplain was rushing out the door to catch the ambulance that was ferrying Mr. Saylor to the hospital. He was fading. She called me from the ambulance and told me that he might die. Grabbing 2 books from the library, I made haste back to Unit 4. Inside, I slid the 2 books under Mr. Jackson's door. "This gives me some closure," he told me. I sighed gently from relief. Wanting to be present with Mr. Saylor at the hospital, I rushed out of the prison and drove to Metro, told the receptionist I was there to see the recently arrived prisoner if possible, and then waited in the ER. After 15 minutes, my phone vibrated with an email from the chaplain telling me that security would not allow anyone to be in the room with Mr. Saylor, not even her, and that I should return to the prison. When I finally arrived back at the chapel, the Friday night service had begun. I slipped in quietly to a pew against a side wall. Dropping my head, I whispered prayerfully, "God, forgive us for the hells we create for each other." The chaplain was back in the prison and sitting just in front of me. She reached back and squeezed my hand, whispering that Mr. Saylor was stable. Just a few minutes later, I slipped back out, crouched in a corner of the hall, and wept. I had not been prepared for what I saw that day.